Thank you, Mark, for those kind words. So I'm Radha Gopalan, and what I'm going to talk to you today is joint work with my colleague Bart and Ankit and David, who both, when we started this project, were graduate students here at Erlen, and they both graduated. Ankit is going to be a professor at Indiana University, and David is a postdoc with us. He's still finishing up some of these projects, and he'll be in the academic job market next year. And I'll be remiss if I don't mention this. So in most academic papers in finance and economics, we list the authors in alphabetical order, and that's what we have done here. But about 90% of the work on this project was done by David. So thankfully, Bart and I could not touch the data. And I will tell you why it is. So we did not do anything with the data. So all the data work was by David. So Bart and our job was to structure the analysis and then write it up and position it and present it. So what is this paper about? So this paper is very unusual for my line of work. I typically do work on CEO compensation. So the typical pay package in my papers is $4 million. So here I'm going to be talking about people who are earning about $9 to $10 per hour. So the effect of minimum wages on employment is obviously a very charged and policy-relevant question. So in our own backyard, we had St. Louis City increasing the minimum wage, and then the state of Missouri coming up and saying, no, not so fast, you cannot do that. And that was a very potent issue during the mayoral race. So our job as social scientists has been to try to wrest this question away from the domain of politicians and into the domain of scientists, to provide some scientific backing, some facts which can form the basis for this debate. And unfortunately, I have to say, we have, to a large extent, failed on this task. So if you were to look at the academic literature on minimum wages, it's all over the place. So by the side of papers that say minimum wages are a good thing, you have papers that say minimum wages are a terrible idea. And there are two big reasons for this debate. And this also for non-academics will highlight the difficulty of pinning down facts. And here we are talking about simple facts, and even pinning them down is very difficult. So the first difficulty is data availability. So we don't have rich data on minimum wage employees who we can then focus on to understand what exactly happens when minimum wages go up. Most of the data comes from census, which is at state level aggregates. If not, they aggregate it at the state industry level, and people have been torturing the data to the extent possible to get some knowledge, and depending on how you torture it, you can get the data to say whatever you want. And the second issue is causality. So this is where social sciences and sciences differ enormously. In the sciences, if you want to answer a question, you can go into the laboratory, keep everything constant, run a simple experiment, and get an answer. In social sciences, we don't have that luxury. We don't have the luxury of running experiments, randomly allocating minimum wage increases. So one of the big interesting situations that we have is the Seattle $15 minimum wage. We all would like to know what happens if a city increases its minimum wage to $15. But the best paper out there does a pretty bad job of answering that question, because there is no control or counterfactual to Seattle. Okay, Seattle increased its minimum wage. We need another city very similar to Seattle, which did not increase the minimum wage, which we can compare. So scientists have that luxury, but we don't. And so we have to do with whatever nature provides us in terms of natural experiments to try to understand what is the effect of the minimum wage. So far, the literature is kind of divided on what happens when minimum wages go up. And we add to this debate in a substantial manner in terms of expanding the data that is used to answer this question. And I also feel that we take a few steps in better addressing causality than what the literature has done in the past. So as the term big data is obviously the in thing, so we have put it right there on top. So we do leverage the power of big data to answer this question. So we have access to payroll data for over 2 million hourly wage employees. This kind of data has never been used to answer this question. And I will mention this. So this data came to us through our collaboration with Equifax. So one of my objectives in presenting this is for both people here and for people in cyberspace is to highlight the benefits that both Equifax and us and the greater society has got from this collaboration, and to encourage other companies as well to come forward if they are interested in such collaboration. So we use real granular payroll data to answer this question. And we also, as I mentioned, take a few important steps in addressing the question of causality. And just to summarize, what are our findings? Our findings, like most things that I teach my students, is when you ask a question, the answer is usually it depends. And unfortunately, here again, the answer is it depends. So what happens when minimum wages go up? There are differential effects on employees, depending on whether they are currently employed or whether they are new entrants into the job force. What we find is if you are an existing minimum wage employee, when minimum wages go up, in this case state minimum wages, you are not likely to be fired immediately. You continue to remain employed, you enjoy the benefits of a higher minimum wage, and in some follow-up work, we show that this benefits in terms of your credit practices, in terms of your credit behavior, your credit score, and your access to finance. So all things good happen to existing minimum wage employees when minimum wages go up. But companies that are in states that increase minimum wage slow down the hiring of new minimum wage employees. So if you are a young college graduate who's entering the job force, or you are in college and you're trying to get a minimum wage job, a higher state minimum wage is not good news for you. We find that establishments in states that increase minimum wage slow down the hiring of new minimum wage employees. And so depending on whether a location's population profile is consisting of existing people or a lot of new entrants, a higher minimum wage may be a good or a bad idea. We also find that there is nuance across the industry profile of firms in a location. So we divide industries into those in the tradable goods sector and those in the non-tradable goods sector. A firm in the tradable goods sector is basically competing with other firms in other geographies, not only in the US, but across the world. While someone in the non-tradable goods, like a restaurant or a barber shop, its competition is very localized. It's not competing with firms outside the geography. And what we find is this slowdown in hiring that we document happens almost entirely from those firms in the tradable goods sector. So again, if a location is thinking of should I increase the minimum wage or not, they have to look at the composition of firms in their location. So if what they have are mostly restaurants and barbershops and other entertainment establishments which are in the non-tradable sector, which are not competing for business with establishment outside the geography, then they don't, at least in our sample, they don't react adversely to a higher minimum wage by slowing down their hiring. But on the other hand, if the establishments are more in the tradable sector, like manufacturing, then they are competing with other firms outside the geography who can continue to pay a lower minimum wage, and to compete effectively, they slow down the hiring of new minimum wage employees. So the effects we find are different based on whether you already have a job or you are a new entrant to the job market, and whether the firms in your locality are in the tradable or in the non-tradable goods sector. Okay, so let me talk about the collaboration with Equifax. I would say this kind of collaboration is leveraging the strengths of a city like St. Louis. We are a small town, and we behave like a small town. Everybody knows everybody else. You cannot go to a grocery store without meeting a couple of people who you know. And WashU and Olin is kind of the only game in town as far as world-class research is concerned. So many of our students are employees in local firms, and one of my students and Bath's students, Nasser, is an employee for Equifax, and his job was to market some of their data resources. And what Nasser realized was, once he got into Equifax, that getting qualified talent to do the data analysis, to do the big data work, was very difficult within Equifax. And it was also a very old company. It's more than 100 years old, and it's slow moving. And so it was slow to adapt. So Nasser came up with this brilliant idea and said, why don't you lend me some of your graduate students? You lend me some of your PhD students who, on a part-time basis, will do analysis for me to help me market my data resources, to help me glean intelligence that I can use in my management. And in turn, they're going to get minimum wage. They are actually getting paid minimum wage, by the way, ironically. But their payment will be in kind in terms of access to data, which they can then use to do research and then use to write their thesis. But having said that, I have to make one thing very, very clear. So in this age of Cambridge Analytica, we have to be very careful in terms of what kind of data access we have and how privacy is protected. So first of all, the students have access to anonymized data. So there is no individual identifier that we get to see. We just get to see numbers and columns. Two, they don't get to access data from anywhere. They only get to access data through secure laptop access, and the data continuously sits in Equifax's servers. The data never comes to our servers, so we don't take possession of any data. And as I mentioned, Bart and I don't get to touch the data. We just get to see the tables. Even to see the tables, we had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So Equifax has built this infrastructure. So if any other company is looking at such collaborations, it is essential to build the infrastructure to ensure data integrity. But having said that, this collaboration has been on for a year and a half, and they are thrilled with it. So as I mentioned, Ankit wrote his job market paper with the data. He's placed very well. David is currently writing it, and we have our third student entering this collaboration. So what is the data that we use? We use the data from their product called the Work Number database, which is basically payroll data. Companies and establishments send their payroll information to Equifax because Equifax does employment verification on behalf of the companies. And that is the data that we use in our research. And that data is also merged with the credit data. So we are also exploring a number of questions in the interaction of the labor market and credit market. So experimental design. So let me come to the specific experiment that we run. So we have data from 2010. So given the time span for which we have data, we then said, if we want to answer the question of minimum wages, what are the natural experiments that nature provides us? And we identified 6 different natural experiments. So 6 states increased their minimum wage sometime around 2014. And these were substantial increases. These were increases of 75 cents to $1. So the states are highlighted. So the conditions we put are, this increase should have happened between 2010 and 2015, which is when we had the data. We wanted it somewhere in the middle so that we have pre and post information. We also wanted the increase to be substantial and isolated because we wanted to see what exactly happens when this minimum wage goes up. And that resulted in these 6 states increasing the minimum wage. And then to run our experiments, as I mentioned, we need a control sample. We need to compare what happened in these states to what happened in the states that did not increase minimum wage. Our control states are basically states that are adjacent to these treated states, the states that increase the minimum wage. For example, Michigan increased its minimum wage, which is where I went to grad school, which is one of the treated states. And for Michigan, we have Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin as the control states, the 3 other adjacent bordering Midwestern states. And so what we are going to do is to look at a firm like, say, Walmart, which has establishments both in, this is South Dakota, right? I'm sorry, I should have. Anyway, so which has establishment in North Dakota. And it also has establishments in the adjacent control state. And we are going to compare what happened to minimum wage employees in this establishment as compared to minimum wage employees in this establishment. So we are doing the comparison within a given firm. Within a given firm that has establishment both in the state that increased the minimum wage and establishment in the adjacent state that did not increase the minimum wage. This is the power of our data. So this is the big step that we are taking in terms of establishing causality by focusing within a firm, by focusing within adjacent states, and looking at what happened to the employment of minimum wage employees. Should I stop and ask questions, or should I wait till the end for questions? How does it work?
You just wait to the end.
Okay. So this is the math for the math geeks in the room. So I'm not going to go through this equation in any great detail. But this is effectively what we put up on slide to impress people that we are like, we did a lot of rigorous analysis. So let me show you the results. So what are the results here? So here, the outcome variable that we are looking at is employment. Is an individual employed or not? And the time period we are looking at is the 12-month period before the minimum wage increase and the 12-month period after the minimum wage increase. So here, time 0 is when the minimum wage was increased, say in Michigan. And we compare, this is the 12-month period before the minimum wage increase. As compared to this time, how much more likely is a minimum wage employee to be employed in any month as compared to similar minimum wage employees in the control state? So these dots here represent the likelihood of employment of a minimum wage employee in the treated state as compared to the likelihood of employment of a similar employee in the control state. And the bottom line conclusion, all these are all fancy, the bottom line conclusion you need to see is this dot is pretty close to this horizontal line, which represents 0, a null effect. What that says is the employment likelihood of a minimum wage employee does not change when the state increases its minimum wage. If you are a minimum wage employee in Michigan, 12 months before Michigan increases its minimum wages, you are no more or no less likely to be employed as compared to a minimum wage employee in Wisconsin or Indiana or Illinois. So this is the null effect. This is the effect that says minimum wage employees are not likely to be fired with any greater likelihood when states increase minimum wage. So here we are talking about the price of a factor of production going up, and at least the existing factors are not getting retrenched. But that is only half of the story. So in this table, what we do is we look at establishments. So what are establishments? Establishments are basically a firm-state combination. So Walmart in Michigan. And we look at how many low-wage employees does Walmart in Michigan employ. How does that change as compared to the number of low-wage employees that Walmart employs in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin? And we are looking at 1 year before to 1 year after Michigan increases the minimum wage. And this negative coefficient with the stars by its side says Walmart significantly reduces the number of low-wage employees in Michigan as compared to Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin after Michigan increases its minimum wage. So that's what this negative coefficient indicates, that Walmart reduces the number of low-wage employees in Michigan when Michigan increases its minimum wage relative to the number of low-wage employees in the adjacent states. And what drives this reduction in employment? It's not firing of existing employees. Walmart doesn't fire its existing employees, which is what we saw in the previous slide. It reduces the number of low-wage employees it hires. So when we look at the number of new low-wage employees that Walmart hires, those go down when the state increases its minimum wage. We also focus on other ways in which firms could adjust. We look at whether there is turnover. Are employees leaving Walmart in response to a minimum wage increase? Maybe the opportunities have increased or opportunities have gone down. We don't find any significant change in the turnover likelihood of low-wage employees following the minimum wage hike. Is Walmart closing its stores in the states that increase minimum wage? No, not really. So the insignificant coefficient dash says Walmart is not closing its stores in response to a minimum wage hike. What Walmart is doing is it's slowing down hiring of new minimum wage employees. Now, we then differentiate across industries, as I mentioned before. And we tried a number of differentiations. Frankly speaking, I should be truthful with you. None of these seem to matter as much as what I'm showing on this slide. So the only cut that seemed to make a big difference is when we divide industries into non-tradable and tradable. As I mentioned, an example of non-tradable is the restaurant sector, wherein you are competing with other restaurants near you. And an example of tradable is manufacturing, where you are competing with other factories outside your location, not only in the country, but outside the country. When we look at this slowdown in hiring that I showed in the previous slide and broke that down into non-tradable and tradable, we find that there is no significant slowdown in hiring of establishment in the non-tradable sector. So for example, I saw somebody from the St. Louis Zoo. St. Louis Zoo is an example of a non-tradable good. Clearly, it's not competing with other zoos outside St. Louis. And this insignificant coefficient says that such establishments don't reduce their hiring in response to a higher minimum wage. But if you look at the tradable goods sector, there's a very large and significant decline in hiring of new low-wage employees. If you have a manufacturing plant making the economist's favorite product with its widgets and competing with other countries, then you slow down hiring in response to a minimum wage hike. Now, when you slow down hiring, but you don't close your establishment, what do? How do you run with fewer employees? And what we find interestingly is you increase the hiring of slightly higher wage employees. In other words, if you would have done something with a couple of minimum wage employees, you hire one higher wage employee to do the job, maybe with some mechanization, maybe with some technology. So we are not able to detect the technology because we don't have sufficient power, but what we are able to detect is, yes, you do increase the hiring of slightly higher wage employment while reducing the number of low wage employees in your establishment, and this happens solely in the tradable goods sector. Okay, that's about all I have. So to summarize, we have this very unique collaboration with Equifax that provided access to granular low-wage employment data that helped us address this very important policy question, that helped us make huge leaps in terms of what data is brought to bear on this question, that also helped us take a few steps in terms of identification, in terms of doing a valid comparison. And our result is a higher minimum wage has a nuanced effect on employment. While it does not reduce the likelihood that existing employees are going to continue to be employed, it reduces the hiring of new low-wage employees. And this reduction happens predominantly in the tradable goods sector, and there is no effect on the non-tradable goods sector. Finally, as far as the normative question of should I increase a minimum wage, does a higher minimum wage make sense or not? The answer to this question, as is clear here, depends on your population profile and the profile of firms you have in your locality. If you have a growing population with a lot of new entrants, with a lot of new workers coming in, then a higher minimum wage is not a good idea because our study shows that those new entrants will find it very difficult to enter the labor force. If your firm profile is more towards the tradable goods, if you have a bunch of manufacturing industries, then our study says a higher minimum wage is not a good idea because those firms are competing with firms outside, and they will find it very difficult to pay the higher minimum wage. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Sean Murphy, MBA 2010. Excellent job, very engaging. I think you broke this down in a way that most lay people could understand, and I really appreciate that because I'm one of those people. I don't. The formulas go straight over my head. So, a lot of intuitive findings here. The one question I have here, and I didn't bring a notebook, so I'm taking notes in the Notes app here of my iPhone. So you said Walmart reduces the number of minimum wage employees in Michigan following an increase in minimum wage. And were you saying that it is the same observed phenomenon with folks in the tradable goods sector? Is that correct? That we saw that when there was an increase in that minimum wage, that in tradable goods, you saw the same exact phenomenon. Is that correct?
Yes. So the tradable goods result is just a break. I should have been careful in not using Walmart example. But yes, it's just breaking up of this. So the Walmart example is to illustrate this result. This result that we have, that the number of low-wage employees go down in establishments in states that increase the minimum wage. And when we break down these into tradable and non-tradable, we find that this is driven mostly by the tradable goods sector.
Okay. Okay.
And let me just add there, so there's another way firms can deal with the minimum wage aside from reducing employment, right? It's raising prices. And kind of the idea of the tradable versus non-tradables is in tradables, because of global competition, you can't raise prices. And there's some other studies that show in the non-tradable sectors, restaurants and so forth, increases in the minimum wage are associated with higher prices for, establishments that are selling in those things. So some of the minimum wage increase for non-tradables is able to get passed on in terms of higher prices to consumers.
Okay, makes perfect sense. So taking this a step further, you found causality for hiring medium-waged employees in the tradable sector. So in other words, that there is causality here. They are related, that a subsequent, when wages in tradable goods sector are brought up, on low-wage employment, you did see that significant decrease, but a causality on the effect of medium-wage employment concurrently. Is that correct?
Yes, this is as much causal as this.
Okay, okay.
These both happen concurrently.
Okay. The one piece that I was hoping to see, and I don't know if this question has been answered ages ago, but is when you have this increase in wages, what is the effect on the economy in those states? Can the data answer that question? Because ultimately what I would like to see, I'm married to a social worker who's a dean over at the social work school. I'd like to see some sort of thrust that says, like, yes, this is doing good for society because look right here, the data tell us that the increase in the wages is passed on to the economy, and these states have more robust economies as a result.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And we economists are always very scared of big questions because answering those big questions in a robust manner is extremely difficult. So that's why we are putting together this jigsaw piece, one piece at a time. So we look at employment. In another companion piece, we look at the credit, access to credit, and their credit behavior. We can possibly look at health outcomes. So that is something, if you have data, we would love to do health outcomes. So we put together these small micro outcomes. The problem with answering how does a higher minimum wage affect the economy is there are too many moving parts. Again, this comes back to our inability to run experiments. So there are too many moving parts with the result that the facts are very difficult to establish. So then you can torture the data to get the result that you want. And so it is a very important question, but it's also a very difficult question to answer in a convincing manner.
I guess I would add one thing we can say here in terms of the economic effects. It's hard to say, and I'm not sure how meaningful to say overall is it going to be good, because I think what we're showing is, yes, for some people, if you're an existing minimum wage worker you already have a job, raising the minimum wage, your pay goes up. I mean, that's awesome, and the firm isn't letting you go. So they're winners. I mean, the existing employees are certainly people in, at least our study is showing, are winners from an increased minimum wage. The losers are the people who don't have a job. That, part of the problem we have for many unskilled workers in our society is actually getting them on the employment ladder. And what this is showing is consistent with the idea that for these people, this is a really bad outcome. They're going to have trouble getting that first job. And while we don't have any data on things like race and so forth, I mean, we know that unemployment rates are significantly higher for black youth or, young African American workers. We might think that something like this would be particularly bad for them, right? Because they're the people that if they don't have a job, they're not going to get hired. The folks who have a job, their pay went up 10%. That's awesome, right? So that's kind of when we say, is it good for society? It's hard to say overall, and that kind of average increase masks kind of very, very big compositional effects where things can be really good for some people, or, good credit effects and so forth, and really bad for these other people who now are increasingly, in essence, rationed out of the market.
That's good color and context because that answers a different question
Yeah.
in society.
Yeah. Okay. It's kind of nice to be the voice of God.
So it seems to me that the effect is negative, right, on minimum wage rises because it makes it harder for minimum wage level members of the labour force to find a job, right?
New entrants.
New entrants,
and there's
yeah.
a new entrants, and there's a substitution effect, right? So in the sense that the medium, higher than average wage, or average wage employees get hired more.
Yeah.
So that it hurts the very people it's designed to protect. It seems to me.
That's my conclusion, is for the people that we often think we want to help, people don't have jobs and so forth, it's not good. On the other hand, I mean, as an anti-poverty strategy towards the working poor, which also is a group that a lot of people feel comfortable helping, I mean, this may be something that's actually very helpful for them. You get a 10% increase in your wage if you already have a job, and so that's payoff for them. But for people, unskilled people who, part of the way you get skills is by having a job, this is really harming them.
Yeah. So effectively, this is the positive result, that existing workers are not fired. So usually the opponents of the minimum wage say you raise the minimum wage, people are going to lose jobs and be on the streets, and that is not happening. Yeah, you're right. For new entrants, it's much more difficult to get jobs, and there is also substitution. But then substitution, again, can be colored as a good thing or a bad thing. Some people will say creating more middle-class wage jobs is not a bad thing.
And the other thing we're not able to do that is certainly a lot in the news is think about how this would affect firms' use of automation to replace unskilled workers. And so we don't have the data to say about what are the long-term effects on capital investment of, automated checkout things at, retail stores or that sort of thing. Would higher minimum wages actually encourage firms to invest more in that kind of capital at the detriment of unskilled workers is something we don't have the data to look at, which is also a 5-year, 10-year phenomenon.
Again, two things that I wanted to add, the caveats that I wanted to add, which I remembered when Bart said this, is we are looking at large firms in our sample.
Yeah.
So we don't have mom and pop shops in our sample. So to the extent the response or the ability of mom and pop shops to observe an increase in costs, that response might be different from what we observe here. The second thing is we are only looking 1 year out. There could be long run effects that we are missing. So we are looking at what happens 1 year after a minimum wage increase. And to that extent, we are not capturing any of the long-run effects.
Do you observe any effect of a minimum wage increase on firm behavior across states? And so your example of Walmart in one state, do you observe that a change in policy in one state causes a uniform change in the firm's pay, approach to compensation for minimum wage employees?
That's a good question. We have not tested for that. So, but the fact that they have differential employment response raises a question that they may not have a uniform wage response. So if Michigan increases the minimum wage, Walmart employees in Indiana don't automatically get a raise. But that is a question that can easily be addressed with this data, and we have not observed that. This cross-state spillovers to state policies, not just minimum wage, any state policy, through firms, through multi-state firms, is a very interesting question. We have not explored that.
I would say, yeah, we would love to explore that. I mean, another interesting piece is when you look at the data and you see, say the minimum wage goes from $8 to $9 in California, what you see is everybody who was making below $9, whether they were making $8 before the minimum wage or between $8 and $9, just gets pushed up to $9. So it's not, there's not any push of those people who were making $8.75 going to $9.75. Everybody gets a raise up to the new minimum wage. But whether or not these, and this is something you would think in a place like St. Louis, where, you know, if the minimum wage went up in Missouri and not Illinois, would you see spillovers across? How costly is it for HR folks to implement different policies in these adjacent states? We would love to see, and it probably varies a lot by firm.
Thanks. So was wondering whether it could be that employees are stickier within their current role and aren't maybe churning as much between individual roles. So in the low wage sector, if they're not churning into another one, then that obviously would reduce the likelihood that somebody could be a new hire if they're being stickier in their role, because they're like, well, I'm getting paid more now, so I don't need to leave to do something else. I know you checked for the, what it did on employment overall, but whether or not that employment was sticky within the same role or something like that obviously couldn't be addressed by this data, but wondering if you assessed churn in and out of the firm or something like that.
So we did look at turnover in and out of the firm. So we looked at voluntary and involuntary turnovers, and we did not find any effect. But I think what you have in mind is more intra-firm, within the firm, whether you stick to the same role or you shift to a different role. Unfortunately, the role data is not very clean. And so Equifax is actually invested in cleaning it up. So if and when making it uniform across firms. And so if and when they make it uniform, but it is going to be kind of coarse, which is not going to capture all the nuances of roles within organizations. But if and when we have the roles data, we would love to see if that's the case or not. But what we do observe is turnover does not change. Employees are not quitting voluntarily to go to other firms.
My question, very thought-provoking, and I guess, how do you interpret this? How does this make the decisions better? You know, whether you should raise minimum wage, because it becomes very political. My mom is a social worker, so I kind of have some of these similar conversations. So my question really is the impact that geography might have, because you're talking about states, and I know minimum wages, I've worked for a retail company before, and it varies by city now. It's not just the states, it's cities are doing their own. We talked about St. Louis. When you're in geography like a San Francisco, which is a thriving city, and you have geography, it's a peninsula, you got water surrounding you. My observation is it's easier to do that because you're thriving and you're not going to lose business as a result of it if it's a restaurant and those sort of things. Same probably true for Seattle, thriving. But when you were like, so the applicability of this St. Louis metropolitan area, you have the city of St. Louis is probably down to about 15 or 20% of the metropolitan area from a population perspective. It's got a fluid border on the western side. The perception of the politicians is that we're doing some good, and the reality is it's not a thriving city, you know, and they're raising it. I know it didn't take effect, but the thought is it's going to do good for the people who are employed, but the overall impact, I think again, you're not drawing broader conclusions from this, but the implication is it really could have a negative impact on the city of St. Louis for future employment. Is that correct?
The short answer is yes, it is correct. So you are right that the economic vibrancy of the local area matters a lot. And the way it would matter is, say, for example, in whether a minimum wage binds at all or not. So in San Francisco, if the economy is booming and there is so much demand for labor, wages may naturally raise. So even if they have a higher minimum wage, the number of employees it will affect might be very small. But in an economy that is not booming, that is stagnating like St. Louis City, there may be a lot more. The wages are not going to go up naturally. So a higher minimum wage is going to bite especially. And as you rightly said, if the jobs are porous, if the locality is porous and firms can easily shift, then it's even bigger problem. So for those of you interested, I love listening to podcasts. One of the podcasts is about Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, wherein Kansas and Missouri compete with each other in giving tax breaks to firms, and firms just shift across the street. So one couple of years they're on one side of the street, and the next year, 2 years, they are on the other side of the street. So they get front-loaded concessions and back-loaded benefits, and the states never see those back-loaded benefits because firms have jumped shop by the time they realize. So exactly, how porous the border is, how the surrounding area is, has a big impact on what the effect would be.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, the smaller, you're pointing out, the smaller is the geography, the more we might expect these locational issues to come into play. You know, we're talking about broader states. We didn't find a location effect. So we didn't find that Walmart is closing or other stores are closing these kind of stores in California and moving to Nevada. But if you're just talking about St. Louis City, and I can go 3 miles to St. Louis County, which doesn't have a higher minimum wage, we might find a lot more of those locational effects, and especially amongst smaller, newer, more entrepreneurial types of businesses, right? And those are the kinds of businesses, I think, that places like, I'm an entrepreneurship professor, so those are the kinds of businesses that I think are important for places like the city of St. Louis to attract. And those are the kind of firms that have more choice about where to go, I think. And I would also add just this thing about, while we can say anything about prices, I mean, this idea that, hey, I can pass on a minimum wage increase in terms of higher prices. You know, that's something that hurts potentially, and literature seems to be pretty good in that dimension of showing that higher minimum wages are associated with slightly higher prices in terms of restaurant food and the like, which, you know, makes consumers worse off. Maybe not very, very worse off, but a little bit worse off, right? Yeah, one of the issues with a paper like this where we have kind of this nuanced conclusion is that there's something for everybody to dislike. So minimum wage opponents dislike what we're doing, and minimum wage proponents dislike what we do. But that's the beauty of science.
I was going to wait till you were done with the paper research. Just curious. I was just curious about the labor market that we're in right now is very tight. So a year ago, we're having these minimum wage discussions that seem to be decreasing with the tight labor market. So just like you to speak for a second about the changing labor markets and how this affects this research and your opinions going on in the market.
So there are, we don't do it, but there are papers that look at minimum wage increases in tight and slack labor markets. And not surprisingly, they find that minimum wage increases in slack labor markets are especially problematic. While minimum wage increases in tight labor markets are not so problematic, as we said, the market is tight, the wages are going up naturally, and the minimum wage is just keeping up with that. So that would be one thing that I would add is the effects might vary and might be less pronounced if the labor market is tight.
I would just add, and this is kind of broader than this paper, which is I think while labor markets are tight, there's still a lot of evidence that there's mismatches of skill. And I think that's a big issue is how do we, while labor markets are tight, wages aren't really going up, which suggests people aren't either, employers aren't paying more, or it's that people are also need to get more skill in order to increase their pay. And the concern here with something like the minimum wage is how does that affect skill formation? For people who the best way to get skill is to work for somebody. I mean, it's to get an education, and then once you finish your education, is to work for somebody, learn on the job. And to the extent that minimum wages are keeping people on the sidelines, now there are people, the unemployment rate may be low, but there's also people who aren't in the labor force that maybe the reason they're not in the labor force is nobody wants to hire them because they're not really employable. That's my concern in this is not a tight labor market. Yes, that's great. It's good for workers. Unemployment is low, but are we seeing this mismatch in skill? And we're also seeing wage growth. And if you don't have the opportunity because of a minimum wage to get skill, then that's a potential negative, even in a tight labor market of this. But as I said, for people who already have a job, they're getting skills and there are all sorts of benefits for them. That's where the nuance comes in.
I'm just curious how things work. So on this subject, do politicians and policymakers, do they come to you asking about this? Or do you reach out to them and share what you've learned and understand? So is there a dialogue? I mean, this is great, but does it go beyond the classrooms here?
It does. We don't, I don't know, can't speak for RADA. I don't typically reach out to people, but people do reach out to us. So probably shouldn't say, but there was a mayoral candidate in the last St. Louis mayor's election that asked me about the minimum wage, and I gave him my opinion based on this research, and he made a call, kind of on his own thought and so forth in terms of whether or not he would support an increased minimum wage for St. Louis. It turned out he did not, and that hurt him, It's Antonio French, who was one of the mayoral candidates, who's one of our alumni, and yeah, that wasn't popular in the city.
So, and we do reach out. So we have a very good media relations group. So whenever we have these research, we write blog posts. We try to publicize it. Say, for example, we have publicized this work. I also have related work on Medicaid and ACA. So Medicaid expansion is a big deal, and states are slowly changing their views on Medicaid expansion. And I have a paper showing some of the benefits of Medicaid expansion, and so we try to publicize it and make people in Jefferson City aware of that research. So we do try to do it, but at some level, politicians are politicians. So however much they may pay lip service to being fact-based, they are going to form their policies based on their constituents' preferences. And so there will be cherry picking of facts. And if the facts support their political view, then we will get heard much more than not.
Yeah, but that's a thank you for clarifying that. I mean, we are reaching out to do that, but it's, again, we're scientists first, right?
Yeah.
That's our goal, is to put the facts out there in a reasonable way and then, inform the debate.
Hi, have you seen any, excuse me, have you seen any links between an increase in minimum wage and employer-funded benefits offerings?
Short answer is no. We have not looked at it. We don't have the data for it. Or at least we have not put in a rigorous search to find the data. So there were so many low-hanging fruits that we could tackle with the data that we had. We haven't looked at that.
I haven't really seen in the rest of the literature, and this is the advantage of our data, is that we have really precise data on how much people are making. Other studies are usually, as Rada said, are using census-type data, where they do ask about things, non-wage benefits. They usually ask it fairly poorly. So like health insurance, for example, would be one. Now, for many people who are making the minimum wage, obviously they qualify for Medicaid. And so employers, so the short answer, long answer, sorry, my confusing answer to your question is really, we don't really know very much about non-wage benefits. Yeah, health insurance would be the one that would be interesting to see, but that's complicated by Medicaid eligibility, I think.
So my name is Todd Milborn. I'm the Vice Dean of Faculty and Research, so excellent work on here. I don't want to bring closure to the questions, but if you're a firm, and I'll kind of echo what Radha was teeing up at the very beginning, if you're a firm that has data, such rich data that it's hard to sort of either have the resources internally to mine those data, to actually do the work, come talk to me. I've got a card. Talk to Radha, talk to Bart, talk to anybody in the room. And if there's a collaboration like this, we do have a lot of below minimum wage employees known as PhD students. We all paid our dues there, so it's kind of, it's the part of the process circle of life. But to this, to these kind of collaborations are amazing. I mean, for us to get access to these data and to get sort of agnostic, objective eyes, a little bit in the lines of the last question, or the second to last question, excuse me, that came up, we'd be happy to work with you. And, if it's a smaller project, maybe it's just a team of students. If it's something that's much bigger, then maybe it's one you want to make sure we get faculty involved in. But please do reach out, or if you know of other firms that could do something like this. It's obviously, I think it's good for us for sure. I think it's good for the firms. And if we can change the policy debates in meaningful ways, that is exactly the spirit of what we're doing and the whole title of this series, of research that actually impacts business, rather than the 8 people that are going to read the journal article or the 30 of us that are in the room. We want that to be more expansive.
And I would just add to that, I mean, one thing that, along the lines of big data, a lot of you are interested in big data and have worked with it some. Big data, there's 2 things, right? It's predicting things, what's going to be the value of something tomorrow. The second piece, which a lot of people do, and there's a lot of ways to do that, we do that. The second thing, though, that I think is really the next frontier with things like big data is what we call inference. Does X cause Y? That's what this paper was all about, and that's something that I think we bring to the table, that kind of causal question, or being able to use big data to answer causal questions that folks in the industry have not quite gotten to yet. That's the current frontier of research in big data. That's what we do, and we've done it for years. And so I think that's also where companies, policy debates, where we add a lot of value, as in this case. Does a minimum wage cause employment, not just let's predict employment levels, which what a lot of people in big data can do now. What this causal question is something that's what we're experts at, and what academics spend a lot of time thinking about, which as I said, I think is the bigger question is how we use big data to answer questions like this.
And just to add 2 things, so don't feel sorry for our PhD students. They're getting fabulous jobs out of this work. So I have students falling over themselves, like queuing up outside my room to get their hands on this data. And the second thing is, while many firms are great at handling data, I have interacted with a lot of firms who are not able to wrap their head around their data resources. They don't know what data they have, they don't know where the data is, they don't know how to translate the data into business intelligence. We are, again, experts at that, because that is what we do at some level. This causal question is, it's basically policy as far as business decisions are concerned. Should I do X or should I do Y? And how do I decide? And you can decide if you know what X and Y will do to your firm's performance, which is a causal question. How does X affect firm performance? How does Y affect firm performance? So if you are struggling to understand and harness your data resources, please knock on our doors and we will do whatever we can to help you with that.
Okay, perhaps we should bring morning to a close. It's, I suspect there aren't that many people on minimum wage here, so your time is valuable. So if we go over, it'll be a little bit expensive. So thank you Radha and Bart, for a great presentation, and your co-authors. That was impactful research, which is what the school is all about. So thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you.